Hi, my name is David Norris and I'm here to reach more, serve more and create more memory health in people's lives. So thanks for joining me on this journey and to make memory loss a rare condition so you and your family and your community can live a life on your own terms.
This is the Memory Health Made Easy podcast, the show where you learn practical tips and experts share advice on what you can do to boost your brain span to match your lifespan. Now to the host of the show, David Norris.
I don't know if you know much about me, and given this is only the second episode, I doubt you do, but one of the things that I love doing is getting near the water. And sadly, where I live here in Australia, I've got to travel about an hour to get to the beach. I love surfing, love getting in the water. So this year I made a New Year's goal that I would learn how to stand up paddleboard and to explore the waterways around my community. I love doing it. I find I wake up early, I pick the tide times, and I get up and I experience the stillness of the morning. I get out, paddle, no one is around. And on the tide times that I do pick means that there's no water flowing of any great velocity. It's not moving fast, so it's very easy to paddle. There is a sense of calmness. In fact, when I stop, it's very hard to detect movement of how I'm moving in the water. And I guess this observation made me reflect on today's podcast, which is about us in our life. Our lives is very much one of a river. We start early on, right upstream, and we've got a raft and we're moving down the river. Whilst we move down the river early on in our lives, it's very hard to detect the changes in the shoreline. In fact, the water is moving so slowly that we don't detect this change at all, much like my stand-up paddleboarding experience. However, if we make some choices in our lives, perhaps we're staying up late, or as I met a gentleman earlier in the week who acknowledges and champions the fact that he can burn the candle at both ends, we are going to add more things in our life raft that are going to propel us quickly down the river. As we progress down the river, we're going to see some changes in our ability to do things. We may not be more effective. We're lacking energy. We're not performing at our best anymore. These changes, I guess, are starting to show, some subjective signs that, hey, I'm not feeling as sharp. As we progress and maybe add more things of drinking, less sleep, poor nutrition, they're going to add more things into our life raft. And all of a sudden, we're getting into the rapid territory. For me to make a change right now, to set a new course, to make a pivot change whilst experiencing that rapid flow in our life is going to require more energy, more effort on your behalf to make a change, to fight the changes in the stream or that river now that it's flowing. You don't want to end up in that rapids area and approaching the waterfall. We really want to put some energy to map a new course. So today's podcast, I guess, is about appreciating that throughout our life, we will add things to our life raft that will either propel us down the river or make it more sedentary, make it slower. Today's podcast is about establishing where am I at with my own personal risk factors. Where am I at on that life course stream? Am I approaching the rapids? What insights can I get to help me navigate away from this situation? And it's with that in mind that we're going to dive into understanding a little bit more about the numbers and where to start gathering that information. You'd appreciate that if we ignore it, maybe even those early phases of feeling the shoreline pass us by a little bit quicker, they're going to be the phase of our lives predominantly for many people in our 40 and 50 plus years. It's that time when we're starting to notice these changes in ourselves and we go, maybe that's to do with age. Or, I put to you, is it about the choices that we've made beforehand and that are adding up to our personal risk factors? I am on a mission, and I'll say it quite regularly, to reduce our risk for memory loss. And it all starts about understanding what is my personal risk factors. So I guess, what are we really up against here? Well, the numbers paint a really scary picture for many of us. And that is one person every 3 seconds is diagnosed with dementia worldwide. One person every 3 seconds. I often get asked, hey Dave, what's dementia? What is it? Is it the same as Alzheimer's? We've probably heard the two terms and used them interchangeably, but really dementia is the umbrella term which represents severe and pronounced memory loss. When people come into the clinic and see me, and if I'm using any of my assessment tools, I'll certainly notice some changes, and it'll either indicate that they're at a mild cognitive impairment state or experiencing pronounced cognitive impairment, or those changes where it's impacting my ability to live, to perform, maybe manage my finances, to perform daily activities. And they're the things that I often see with folk that are progressing through that disease process. Really, we want to be in front of the curve. We want to be putting ourselves in a position where we can reduce our risk for memory loss. Think of it like a continuum. Early on, upstream, we become maybe aware in our 40 plus years the changes that I'm not as sharp, or I get a little bit brain foggy or fatigued in the afternoon. I just put that down to being 40. But really, it's us being aware that these are subjective changes, the changes that I can detect in myself. If we're looking downstream or further along that continuum as things change, maybe we don't take the actions right now and we let it go. And it progresses to a point where we start to get mild cognitive changes, mild memory health changes. And these things are going to affect our ability to remember names, places, events, details, location of objects. And it is going to be detectable on assessment. So when we use some of our tools to look under the hood, so to speak, I can see the changes in comparison to people who are of the similar age group. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that if I'm a little bit fuzzy, if I'm a little bit more moody, if I'm a little bit more irritable, or I've got a slightly foggy brain, that's going to be a fairly standard experience. Roughly around 35% of us each day will experience this, but it's paying attention to this, particularly in our 40 plus years. We are more at risk, particularly if we experience mild changes where it is detectable on testing, to progress to dementia, which is 6 times more likely to progress to dementia. Now, it is not always one-way traffic, and our efforts today can help avoid that destination of ending up with severe memory loss where we're unable to live independently, we're unable to make choices clearly, we're not interpreting the world anymore with clarity. So what happens around 40 years of age? Well, Dr. Dale Bredesen, a research neurologist out of the US, paints a really interesting picture here, and I credit him with this information, which is we know that associated with cognitive changes, and especially with Alzheimer's type dementia, there is a buildup of amyloid beta, a protein in our brain, which is somewhat like a master key. Now, you and I, who are, I'm in my 40 years, right now I will have a bit of this stuff floating in my brain between the 2 working units of my brain, being called neurons. Now, in between and how they communicate in this junction, in this gap, it's a chemical mediation. They don't actually touch, but there is a signaling process that happens in that space. In that space, we have amyloid beta building up. Now, at night time, we have our brain janitors come through, the glial cells, and as well as other functions that are helping clean up that space. What happens over time is that there is an increase in this element, particularly if we're going to be exposed to some risk factors like we're not sleeping as well. We have a build-up of this, an accumulation. There is a tipping point. A tipping point where there is so much accumulation of this amyloid beta protein that it's like tipping a master switch in the cells around it. It binds to the cell walls and it causes a change in its behavior. What's interesting and what we observe, according to Dr. Bredesen, is that it begets more of itself. There is an ongoing cycling forward reaction. In one way, we can see the situation as the key that unlocks the door to, release the brain demolishers rather than the brain builders. The question that for many researchers has been, well, why does this turn up in the first place? Well, I've already alluded to reduced sleep as being one of those factors that contribute to the buildup of amyloid beta, but what causes it to be there in the first place? And that was the question that Dr. Bredesen and his team investigated. And what they found that there was a whole host of contributing factors. In fact, there are over 50 factors that are contributing to the development of amyloid beta. When he looked at those factors, it painted a very interesting picture. And this really shows us why the drugs don't work, to borrow the line from Radiohead. Given we've got 50 plus factors here contributing to the development of amyloid beta, the interventions presently on the market only target 1 or 2 variables, not the 50 plus variables. So when we look at these 50 plus factors, Dr. Bredesen's able to structure them in a way that describes their presentations about what's contributing to them. And it's, I guess, a clustering of those 50 plus variables into nice, neat packages. And that's going to help us understand what's happening here. So when we look at these observations of memory health threats, they can be observed as a cold presentation, which is to do with vascular markers or our blood supply markers around the integrity of how our blood is being delivered to our brain. We have a hot presentation, which is predominantly an inflammation presentation of those factors that are contributing to the development of amyloid beta. There is a sweet presentation, or that which our body's ability to regulate sugar. Trauma or traumatic presentation, which is contributing to the increase of amyloid beta. This is observed particularly in footballers that has been well published in the US of young onset dementia through repeated head injuries. There is a toxic presentation, which is associated with increasing environmental toxins and its impact on the brain's performance. And then there is a trophic presentation, which is about the chemical messengers and how the body communicates at a hormonal level. Now, it's never a neat fit, but there is commonly a stronger subtype or a dominant subtype with maybe some flavors of other areas. Now, it's about getting deep on understanding your personal risk factors and how that matches up against that presentation type. An analogy we could draw from here is that our brain is protected by a shed roof. As we move through our life, we get a few holes in the roof. Now, what hole is in my roof is going to be different to the next person's and the next person thereafter. So it's having a personalized view of my own risk factors. And the good news is that we don't need to close all the holes, but we do need to close the majority of them so that we stay in a state of brain builders turning up rather than encouraging the brain demolishers to turn up and start doing their damage. So I guess we can paint the picture that there is a lot of factors adding up to our risk for memory loss, and it's just not one. When you look at it, there are things that we can do right now to start to influence our picture, which is around exercise, infection, or reducing our risk for it anyway. Nutrition, sharpening up our food and what we do with it. The environment, what sort of space we're living, working, and thinking about our food sources as well. Sleep hygiene and how well we guard that and protect it. Our social relationships, how deep, nourishing, and giving and receiving those relationships are. Drugs, alcohol, and caffeine will also play a role. Trauma, as I've mentioned, stress, and are we exposing ourselves to ongoing and chronic stress? Genetic and epigenetic. Genetic meaning what is the information I get from mum or dad, and epigenetic being what gets turned on or off in me personally. And lastly, age. As we get older, our risk for memory loss increases. When we look and reflect back on all those variables I've just mentioned, age is the only fixed one we can't do anything about. Now, you might say, hey, Dave, what about genetic stuff? That's pretty fixed, mate, and I can't do anything about that. Well, yes and no. You do inherit information from mum and dad. However, what gets turned on or off, being that epigenetic expression, is going to be a number of factors that will influence that. And these factors include exercise, infection, nutrition, etc., of what we've just gone through. So the choices we make on a day-to-day basis are going to bathe our cells and our genetic information in a rich state which supports brain health, or in a state which is going to be leaning us towards brain demolition, so to speak. We want to stay brain building state as much as possible. So if you're there scratching your head and going, Dave, just hurry up and tell me, how do I get in front of this? Well, here are the 4 things that are important to start to establish your own personal risk profile. Understand where you stand with regards to memory loss now before it's too late. Understand it now so that the stream doesn't start to get more momentum, putting you in a situation where there is more energy, more effort required to shift you on a new course towards being brain health positive. So here's a quick framework to help you gather information about where you stand. No doubt there's a landscape of tests, and it can get really expensive if you go full tilt and try and cover the spectrum. Think back what we spoke about, those clusters of symptoms. It would be worth understanding how the engine is performing. So it's like an engine checkup. The engine checkup is about looking under the hood at those biomarkers, and it's going to include things like blood pressure, your metabolic status of how things are working in your bloods. A blood test with your GP or local doctor is going to help here. This is something that you can do with a standard blood pathology test, but you want to talk to your local medical officer or your GP to get a blood analysis which investigates things like your cardiac health, which will be reflective of your blood supply and how that's working in your body. Looking at sweet factors, so looking at blood sugar regulation and how that is working in your body. Trophic factors, which represents the hormone functions, and there are a variety of different chemical messengers in our body that are worth checking out. So a hormone analysis. Inflammation markers, and understanding how your body or where your body is at from an inflammatory perspective. And lastly, and maybe worth investigating, particularly if all variables have been excluded, looking at some of those toxic elements as well. But I'd suggest start with the base suite of tools that ticks off cardiac, sugar, your trophic factors and inflammatory factors. So once we've got a bit of an engine checkup, we might have a look at number 2, our genetic profile, what we get from mum and dad. As I mentioned earlier, and have discussed often before, that our genetics are not the complete picture. There's a lot of interaction that happens, especially with what we put into our body. The genetics will give us an idea about where we stand for certain risks, but it does not mean that that is our brain destiny. Even for people who experience or have the APOE4 genetic material from mum and dad, puts them at greater risk than the person who doesn't have that information in their body for experiencing dementia. Now, not all people with APOE4 from both mum and dad will go on and experience dementia. So our genetic material is not our destiny. More so, it's about what we bathe that information in that is going to contribute to how the gun's trigger is pulled. So our genes load the gun, but it comes down to the third factor, our lifestyle factors, which pull the trigger. So doing a check of the additives or those lifestyle factors is worth doing. And what are lifestyle factors? Well, these things encompass how we're sleeping, how we're moving, our exercise, what we're eating, our nutrition, and is that aligned up to me personally and my personal situation? These are the lifestyle checks that you can do. And fourth and lastly is a cognitive check, being where do I stand against my peers? How sharp is my memory health and the systems and skills associated with my memory performance? And these are things like our auditory processing, how quickly we're able to perceive and process auditory information. Our visual system, how quickly, again, we process and perceive this, is going to contribute to the health of our working memory and what gets laid down. So there are the 4 elements that are worth checking. The engine check, which is a blood pathology checkup with your GP, a genetic check, which is looking at my familial risks, and we can dive in a little bit deeper there and looking at our epigenetic of what gets turned on or off. Our lifestyle check, which is looking at those factors associated with how we're performing and what information we bathe ourselves in and influence ourselves. So that's from nutrition, exercise, movement, sleep, social situation, drugs, alcohol, for example, are all going to be factors that influence that. If you're hearing this type of information for the first time, or maybe you've heard it before and now it's starting to crystallize in a different way, I hope that is the case for you. But in summing up, there is a really good news story here, and that is you've more control in this situation about reducing your risk for memory loss than perhaps you might have believed. You've got a 4-point system to go through and start to gather information about understanding where you stand, about knowing your numbers that can reduce your risk for memory loss or add up to it. It's about being a ninja and starting to take control of it and cut down those personal risk factors. In future shows, we're going to go deeper on some of those risk factors as well as get guests and talk to people who are battling on a day-to-day basis to get a real view on the simple actions they're taking to reduce their risk. I really appreciate that for some people, this can be quite a confronting and also overwhelming sum of information. But let's just distill it down again. You can look at this by gathering 4 points of information. Your blood risk factors associated with hormone through to inflammation risk that we've mentioned, as well as genetic information, getting an idea around your lifestyle risk factors, and lastly, pulling it all together by doing a bit of a baseline of where you're at with your memory health. and your cognitive performance. Those 4 points are the checklist to start gathering the information so you can reduce your risk for memory loss. My name is David Norris, and this is the Memory Health Made Easy podcast, and I'm grateful that you've joined me today. If you've liked this show, please leave a comment. If you've got a question, please get in touch, as I'll endeavour to answer them personally. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Memory Health Made Easy podcast. It's one way we can stay in touch. I'd be very grateful for your review of today's show, and it's one way you can help me reach more and create more memory health in people. Thank you. The purpose of Memory Health Made Easy podcast is to educate and to inform. It is no substitute for professional care by a doctor or qualified professional. This podcast is provided on the understanding that it does not constitute medical or personal professional advice or services. Instead, we would encourage you to discuss your options with a healthcare provider who specialises in your particular needs.
Thanks for listening. Do you want to stop avoidable memory loss? If so, grab your free Memory Health Toolkit today. Simply go to www.memoryhealthaustralia.com.au to get yours now.